Just ahead, there's another edition of the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's talk and entertainment networks and in the Orlando area of Tough TV 38. I'm Reagan Smith, Public Affairs Director of the Florida News Network.
And I'm political analyst Al Spry. Our guest today, Dr. Ed Kallina from the University of Central Florida, winner of the Fiesta Bowl, and now on the map football-wise.
It is the 50th anniversary of Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty, and Dr. Kallina specializes in that time frame. So we're going to take a look. We'll go back across the years to LBJ and the War on Poverty. The Florida Roundtable begins following these messages. This is the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's talk and entertainment networks and of TV 38 in the Orlando area. I'm Reagan Smith, Public Affairs Director of the Florida News Network.
I'm political analyst Al Spry. I'd like to thank you for joining us, whether you're on Florida Roundtable listening to it on Florida News Network, or whether you're listening to us on or watching us actually on Tough TV, Tough TV 38, occasionally on the Tough TV network nationwide. You can get Tough TV 38 over the air with an antenna. It's HD quality. You can also get it through the Summit broadband cable system. You can ask Dish TV, Dish Network, or DirecTV, or Bright House Cable to add Tough TV, and that way you can get it on your cable too. But you got to call and say, "I want my Tough TV." Do it. I want my Tough TV.
There you go.
The mantra.
All right.
Say it over and over again. Live it. Breathe it. That way you could see us as well as hear us.
and you know, we've been doing this now for some time, and we have had no cracks in the cameras.
No, not that I know of.
That's okay.
So other things were wrong. But winner and loser of the week.
All right.
Let's talk about it. Florida politics. The winner is Paige Kriegel.
Okay.
Paige Kriegel happens to be a former state rep who's eyeing the Southwest Florida seat of embattled U.S. Rep Trey Snortum Raydell. It's a new nickname. Busted for buying cocaine in Washington. She got an early boost from a super PAC that ponied up more than $1 million to get them started. So there you go.
Wow.
Interesting.
Boy, the cost of these congressional all the offices just up and up and up.
Yeah,
incredible.
Costs a lot to have these seats.
Absolutely incredible.
Jeff Atwater's the loser of the week, the CFO, who we've had on the show.
Yep.
He applied for the presidency of his hometown state university, Florida Atlantic in Boca, but did not make the cut to 3 finalists Friday. And to add insult to injury, another politician wowed the selection committee, and that is former Senator George Lemieux.
Yeah.
Ouch.
He was supposed to be the seat warmer for Charlie Crist, when Mel Martinez resigned.
Yes.
Instead of appointing himself to the Senate, Charlie Crist put George Lemieux in there with the notion that he would step aside and Charlie Crist would run and get the Senate seat, except that they forgot about this guy named Marco Rubio. Oops.
It's interesting here. Here's Florida Republican strategist Rick Wilson. He's saying now that it's time for the GOP to change its stance on marijuana. Of course, we had John Morgan on the show a few weeks ago talking about his marijuana petition for a constitutional amendment of Florida's Constitution. We have Mr. Wilson writing for the conservative website Ricochet. He says, quote, "Though I grew up in an extremely permissive environment for that kind of thing, I haven't smoked dope since the 1980s. Never was my thing, really. I don't think it's great. I don't think it's evil. I don't think it's a magical medicine. It's not a revenue panacea for states, but it won't hurt. It's just dope.
Yeah.
I don't want my kids smoking it, and they won't under my roof. There are worse things to get high on, of course, and there are much better. You, of course, asked Trey Raydell, of course, again. Yeah. My preferred modality, like millions of Americans, is a good stiff cocktail. Well, alcohol's a drug, too, folks, as you know. Marijuana prohibition is like every other prohibition. It drives up costs, creates black markets, and criminalizes trivial behavior. Very true. This prohibition feeds an increasingly Kafkaesque, asset forfeiture-driven, militarized police system, again, the war on drugs, and takes up tens of thousands of prison beds that could be occupied by violent offenders. It costs billions in state and federal enforcement programs with an abysmal price-to-punch ratio. You look at the dollars and cents of it, it doesn't make sense to keep it illegal. I think even the GOP and a GOP strategist is finding that out. So I think as this thing picks up steam in Florida, I think you'll see more and more conservatives jumping on the bandwagon in public. They're doing it behind the scenes right now.
And as more and more states take a good hard look at this thing, it will ultimately force the federal government to take a good hard look at its position as well.
Reagan, I make a prediction before we go to break. I see this in 10 years, maybe 5. I see this vast cloud of smoke rising from the peninsula that is Florida. Just rising. Happy little smoke.
Yeah.
Covering the
happy
states.
Smoke. Okay. All right. Well, if we can remember in 5 years.
Well, we'll be breathing that in. I don't know if we'll remember our names in 5 years.
That's
Reagan.
right. All right. Well, this we're going to pause along the network line, and then when we resume, we're going to be joined by my colleague from the History Department at the University of Central Florida, Dr. Ed Kallina. We're going to look back across 50 years at Lyndon Johnson. This is the anniversary of the creation of the War on Poverty. Thunderous. Oh, Lyndon was quite a speaker, you know. We're going to have an unconditional war on poverty. Well, if you'll stay put, we'll have a look at that when the Florida Roundtable continues. We're back. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And Al, as promised, we are joined in the palatial Florida Roundtable studios this day by a good friend of mine and colleague from the University of Central Florida, Dr. Ed Kallina. It's been a couple of years since you were here with us before, but it's nice to have you back, sir.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back.
And I'll let you in on a little secret. Dr. Kallina is the man who brought me on board to the University of Central Florida nearly 8 years ago.
One of my better decisions.
Oh, well, thank you. And we're very happy with this whole thing and having a good time, and it's a delight. Well, as I had mentioned just a few minutes ago, anniversary time, 50 years ago, in January of 1964, Lyndon Johnson gave his State of the Union address, and this was the beginning of the Great Society. He declared an unconditional war on poverty. And I got to thinking about that, you know. And those of you old enough to remember Lyndon, he could thunder. He'd pound on the podium. And boy, he had that old-fashioned give 'em hell delivery that politicians had in the early and mid-20th century. And he thundered on about how we were going to abolish poverty in this country. Well, here we are 50 years later. So we thought we would take a look, and I couldn't think of anybody better than to analyze what's been going on than Dr. Kallina from our history department.
It seems like whenever we declare a war on something, it doesn't ever really go well.
Yeah, geez.
Maybe it's that whole term "war on," like war on drugs, war on poverty. You know. But your thoughts, Professor Kallina?
Well, Johnson is a tremendously important historical figure.
Yeah.
His presidency represented the greatest reform surge from Franklin Roosevelt to the end of the 20th century. And he was someone who was deeply dedicated to the idea of improving the lives of people. I think his greatest accomplishment were the Civil Rights Acts of 1964 and 1965. But after that, he wasn't willing to stop there. He wanted to do a great deal more. And, of course, the whole idea of the war on poverty was one of his more extreme ideas. I think the irony, of course, is that eventually Johnson became identified with the war in Vietnam. But in the end, he always was much more interested in fighting the war on poverty than the war in Vietnam. Mm-hmm. But neither came out terribly well.
Well, what was his? What do you think was the impetus for him to declare this war on poverty? What What drove him? Was it political considerations? Did he want to make his mark, leave his name? Did he really want to help the poverty in America? What do you think was the driving force?
I think there were several factors. I think one had to do with his background. He came from a middle class to poor middle class family in Texas. And among other things, growing up, he had done some teaching, and he had seen poverty in South Texas. It was pretty bad, especially by our standards today. So I think he came out of that experience thinking that something needed to be done. He was an ardent supporter of Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. And then when he became president, I think he was absolutely convinced that he wanted to become well-known. He wanted to become highly regarded, and he thought one of the ways he could accomplish this was by passing a very substantial reform bill, a series of reform bills. So you got the Civil Rights Acts, and then you got the whole Great Society and the War on Poverty. So I think all these factors entered into the picture for him.
And what do you consider to be the hallmarks of the War on Poverty? What do we have now that we didn't have then? What came out of this?
Well, I
talk?
think there were two things going on. One is there was the War on Poverty, which in some ways was part of the larger program, which was the Great Society. But I mean, when you're talking about the War on Poverty, you're talking about things like the Equal Opportunity Act, the Office of Equal Opportunity, the Job Corps, VISTA, Upward Bound, Head Start, which is still around today and is still attracts a great deal of support. And I think at some level you could also argue things like Medicare and Medicaid were part of this as well.
Yeah, this is, and a lot of historians will say that Lyndon Johnson had the most ambitious social program just about of any president ever, even farther reaching than FDR.
Well, I think he wanted to outdo he wanted to out FDR, as some people have said.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, because he served under FDR early in his career.
Right. And the other thing to keep in mind, I think Johnson was very he had learned something from the New Deal and FDR's experience, and that was that there was a limited amount of time to get this legislation through. Johnson had won a big re-election victory in 1964, one of the biggest victories of the 20th century. But what was also important was the Democrats elected a whole bunch of new members to the House of Representatives. And now the House of Representatives was susceptible to reform legislation in a way that it was not before 1964, 1965. But Johnson knew that he had a limited amount of time to do this, and therefore he wanted to move very fast and get as much done as he possibly could in the shortest amount of time, because they knew sooner or later this surge was going to wear out. And if you look at what happened in the 1966 congressional elections, that's exactly what happened, because in those elections the Democrats lost something like 47 seats in the House of Representatives.
Wow.
And after that point, then you were back to a more normal political situation.
Isn't it interesting how history doesn't really change, and that's why how historians are very important to toot our horns, because you saw this similarly with the Affordable Care Act.
Well, I was just about to say that. I think in certain respects, Obama is moving down the same path that Johnson did, that Obama decided that if he was going to get something done, he had to get it done early in his administration, and therefore the tremendous focus on getting that the health care bill passed.
And truthfully, this is the first major health care reform since Lyndon Johnson.
Well, that's right. I think people criticize Obama, even people who are liberals. But the truth of the matter is Obama's clearly the most important reformer since Lyndon Johnson.
Mm-hmm. Jimmy Carter was tremendously ambitious, but he wasn't good at building coalitions or working with the Congress.
Well, yeah, Carter obviously wasn't terribly successful, and even Clinton, who was a much more skilled politician than Carter, had very limited success.
Right, because he tried to put forth a health reform. They were calling it Hillary Care.
Right.
Remember that?
Yes, exactly.
So,
but on the other hand, the circumstances were right in a way in 2009 that they weren't right earlier, because what you got was a kind of Republican collapse in the 2008 elections in the aftermath of the tremendous financial collapse, and this put Obama in a similar position, say, to FDR in the early 30s or Johnson in 1964, 1965. They had the votes there, and they could get their legislation through, at least for a period of time.
How was Johnson able to accomplish this agenda?
Well, the other thing about Johnson, of course, was that before he became president, obviously in the aftermath of Kennedy's assassination, but before that he'd been Senate Majority Leader. And I think most historians believe he was the most effective Senate Majority Leader of the 20th century. He knew how to manipulate Congress, and especially the Senate, in a way that very, very few Senate Majority Leaders have. So he knew exactly how to get this legislation through, and he applied all of his considerable charm and pressure to do just that.
You know, I'm thinking back, and I remember the pictures and the video. Lyndon Johnson was a big man.
Yes,
tall, yeah. and he loved getting in people's faces.
Exactly.
He'd get right up and he'd grab you by the coat.
He was an intimidator.
Yes.
Well, yeah.
Yes.
That's what he was.
And if you didn't go along with him, he'd cut you off. You know, no more photo ops, not kind of any kind of thing like that.
I kind of almost think of Johnson in a way as he would have been great as the head of as a family don for an Italian mob family if he wouldn't have become president. I think of him as kind of a gangster in that way, the way he could manipulate and intimidate people.
But I think the other thing, I think you're right about that, but there was also a sincerity about him. He genuinely believed in all of this. He thought he was doing the right thing, and insofar as there was anything in it for him, it was simply the renown that was going to accrue to him by virtue of having been the president that got all this through.
Right. He wanted to. He had a huge ego, and of course, he wanted to get his name put up in lights and so forth. And I think that was probably a big reasoning behind it. And I think in the next segment, Reagan, we'll talk about if this war on poverty is a failure or a success. That's the big question.
Yeah, right? The Wall Street Journal here recently, on their opinion page, says how the war on poverty was lost. Read the headline. They figured out that in 2011 dollars, that the country has spent nearly $21 trillion in war on poverty-related programs, and that we have almost nothing to show for it. Well, but I guess there's about 80 different programs that have fallen under this umbrella kind of a blanket, and those are some of the things that we do want to address and talk about, and maybe a little bit of the philosophy of exactly what it was that Lyndon Johnson said and what his aims that seemingly have gone astray here, so that we still have about a 15% poverty level. Of course, now folks who are listed as living in poverty have things in their homes that I don't have in mine.
Well, and what's interesting is not only do you have, I mean, obviously there's some successes with it, which we'll talk about. You have less. It's helped a lot of people, obviously, keep them from destitution. But now you have the amount of people in poverty has stayed pretty stagnant, and now, of course, you have the new poor, which used to be known as the middle class, which are moving into a poverty level. So it's a very interesting the way things have changed. Yeah. in this regard.
Absolutely. So we'll take a look at some of those things. Now we'll pause along our network line here to, speaking of ringing the cash register and make a few bucks while we allow the affiliates to do that. We remind you that this is the Florida Roundtable, the service of Florida's talk and entertainment networks and of Tough TV in the Orlando area. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest is Dr. Ed Kallina of the University of Central Florida History Department. We are taking a look at this 50th anniversary of Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty. And if you'll stay put, our conversation continues following these messages. From From Pensacola to Key West and all points in between, you're listening to the Florida Roundtable, a service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks and of Tough TV 38 in the Orlando area. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest today in the studio here with us is Dr. Ed Kallina from the University of Central Florida History Department, and it is a pleasure to have you back with us again, sir.
Well, thank you.
Our conversation today centering on the 50th anniversary of the War on Poverty, created in January of 1964 by then-President Lyndon Johnson. Wednesday, January the 8th, the Wall Street Journal, on its opinion page, had some rather interesting observations on where we have come in 50 years. And if you'll give me just a minute here, they have summarized and brought kind of up to speed in terms of today's dollars. I quote them: the federal government currently running more than 80 means-tested welfare programs that provide cash, food, housing, medical care, and targeted social services to poor and low-income Americans. Government spent $916 billion on these programs in 2012 alone.
It's one of the biggest pieces of the economy.
Yeah. Roughly 100 million Americans received aid from at least one of them at an average cost of $9,000 per recipient. And that figure does not include Social Security or Medicare benefits. Federal and state welfare spending adjusted for inflation is 16 times greater than it was in 1964. If converted to cash, current means-tested spending is 5 times the amount needed to eliminate all official poverty in the United States. Wow. LBJ promised us the war on poverty would be an investment that would return its cost manifold to the entire economy. $21 trillion in 2011, dollars spent over 50 years.
You know what I think about one of the big reasons why LBJ pushed this, in my opinion, of course. He wanted to make sure people kept voting Democratic. You know, he saw that if you can give handouts to people, people are going to be appreciative and vote for the party that's helping them. I think that continues to this day. And that's not to pick on the Democrats per se. If the Republicans would have come up with a good idea like that, they probably would have rolled it out too. I mean, it is all about votes in the end, isn't it, folks? What do you think?
Well, yeah. Your reaction, Dr. Kallina? I mean, $21 trillion in 50 years.
Yeah, and the problem, of course, is that the term poverty can be awfully ambiguous. Mm-hmm. Obviously, poverty in the United States is not what poverty is in a country like India or Latin America or whatever. And even poverty in the United States today is not what poverty was, say, in the 1930s or 1940s when it was much worse. So I think it was always an illusion that somehow you were going to eliminate poverty.
Allow me to do a brief quote here again, because I think this is interesting. It says, according to a variety of government sources, including census data, surveys by federal agencies, the typical American living below the poverty level in 2013 lives in a house or apartment that is in good repair, equipped with air conditioning and cable TV. His home is larger than the home of the average non-poor French, German, or Englishman. He has a car, multiple color TVs, and a DVD player, and more than half the poor have computers, and a third have wide, flat-screen TVs. They are not undernourished and did not suffer from hunger for even one day of the previous year. But they're listed as below the poverty level.
Does that by using that measure, does that mean that the war on poverty has some success then? You say if you say that it keeps them out of the streets,
but they're still on the government dole.
Well, yeah, of course.
But
that was the whole point, Reagan. It was to keep people on the government dole. It was to keep people so that they have a place to live and they don't get angry and riot and all that. Right? That was part of it.
That sounds nice, but the actual quote from Lyndon Johnson is, that he wanted to give our fellow citizens a fair chance to develop their own capacities.
But that would never happen. Yeah, Doctor?
I think this was part of one of Johnson's problems, that his view of poverty, and a lot of the views of liberals at that time, was that there were all these artificial barriers that existed that kept people poor and prevented them from moving into the middle class and enjoying an abundant life. And I'm not a sociologist and I'm not a social scientist, but I think that what you find is if you look at how things have developed, is that a lot of poverty. You can remove some barriers, but that doesn't guarantee that people are going to change behavior patterns, which in many cases are the roots of poverty.
I completely agree with you.
Yeah. I was in high school at the time, and I had a male teacher who got all excited about this war on poverty, and he enlisted to work with this, and he went down into, and I was in Cleveland, in suburban Cleveland. He went into Appalachia, where they were putting refrigerators in homes and whatnot of people who were still wrapping their butter in aluminum foil and putting it in the creek to keep it cold, And they'd go back a year later, and the refrigerator's still sitting there, and the butter was still in the creek.
Yeah, because
he came away very disappointed.
Like Dr. Kallina says, it's hard to change behavior patterns. You can give people money, but then they're still going to keep the same behavior patterns, except now you're subsidizing the behavior patterns. They're not going to all of a sudden say, oh, I'm being helped out of poverty, so now I'm going to be industrious and create jobs and create businesses. Not necessarily. I mean, there have been, I guess, cases, but on the whole, you give people a check. Hey, it's a check. Let's go have some fun. Let's go. You know what I mean? I mean, the big argument that the Republicans and the modern conservatives have, and I understand where they're coming from, is that the more power you give government, the more government has power to do of its own work of its own volition. And the more you increase the deficit, the more it weakens the country economically, for obvious reasons. So keep pumping money on a problem. You keep pumping money. It's like pumping money at the war on drugs. That hasn't worked either over the last 40 years. Government likes to do things and have these big, audacious programs. And, of course, now we're talking modern day about Obamacare. But they don't often have the result that's always promised. In fact, they rarely do.
Well, exactly. And I think the more you look at American history, say in the last third of the 20th century and the early 21st century, it just shows you how right Thomas Jefferson was. Because what Jefferson understood was, and a lot of the people who agreed with him, was that once government started doing things, you created vested interests, which in effect used the government to advance their own interests without regard to any kind of general public interest, and that's precisely what's happened. If you look at the history of the 20th century, it seems to me.
Oh, absolutely, and you could see these things kind of budding in the late 19th century, but now you really see it coming forth. Jimmy Carter, interestingly enough, had a comment made, I believe it was about 6 months ago, where he said America does not currently have a functioning democracy. And I have to agree with him on that. I think we're living through a very, very interesting age where a lot of what's happening, some people, we just had a gentleman on, he called it soft fascism. I call it neo-fascism, but you have this interesting, like you were saying, Doctor, the government getting more and powerful, the vested interests, many of them large corporations who are getting special favors from the government. To me, that's a fascism, but we still have the flag and window dressing and voting, but I don't know how much of that is really a functioning democracy. Your take on that?
Oh, well, I think you get into this terminology, and that becomes very, very slippery.
Yeah, that's for sure.
But you do see where I'm saying,
Yes,
with corporatism,
yes.
and all that. You
Well,
know, you call it different names, but what it is it seems to be a state of where we are entering I think it's a very scary time for freedom, personally.
Well, I think you're right. And again, back to what I was saying before, it's completely antithetical to what people like Jefferson thought the United States was supposed to stand for. And if you look at today's conversation, talk about the founding fathers and the Constitution, but there's no real understanding of what that means. And insofar as there is any understanding, they're perfectly willing to move in the opposite direction.
I want to slip in one other statistic here that the Wall Street Journal brought up, and again, slippery, I suppose, but a contributing factor. 1963, 6% of American children were born out of wedlock. Today, the number is 41%. Talk about scary.
Well, I'll tell you, that's the one thing that's really that nobody talks about. The easiest way to deal with poverty would have people stay married.
Yeah.
Because if you look at the statistics on that, people who are married, people who have children after they are married, there's virtually no poverty in the country.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly where they took that article. So, well, it is time for us to pause again along our network line. Let us remind folks that this is the Florida Roundtable. I'm Reagan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
Our very special guest this day is Dr. Ed Kallina from the University of Central Florida History Department. And if you'll stay put, our conversation continues following these messages. You're listening to the Florida Roundtable, the service of Florida's Talk and Entertainment Networks and of Tough TV 38 in the Orlando area. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And our very special guest this day is Dr. Ed Kallina from the History Department, the University of Central Florida. And Ed, thank you so much. I know you're a busy man, and we appreciate the fact that you could come in and spend all this time with us today. We certainly do. Well, I wanted to talk about Lyndon Johnson a little bit more. Here, he's put himself on a track where he'll be the most progressive president, maybe even more liberal than Franklin Roosevelt, get more done, ambitious, all kinds of programs, as you pointed out earlier. He had a landslide victory in 1964 that gave him a huge majority in the Senate and in the House. I think at one point there was something like 67 Democrats out of 100 in the U.S. Senate. I mean, that's wow. That doesn't happen once a century, maybe. And so here he's got this huge opportunity, and he wants all these programs. But running parallel to all of this is this thing called Vietnam. And as it goes along, the country is beginning to divide, and there's, huge divisions and deep felt antagonisms toward each other. And he didn't, it seems like it was all too much for him. It was, where's the money coming from to pay for the war on poverty, to pay for the war on Vietnam? And ultimately, in my view, Lyndon Johnson becomes an American tragedy. Your notions?
Yeah, I think that one thing to keep in mind, though, that the economy is consistently good through this period. So this is one of the things that helps keep him afloat. Mm-hmm. You've got an economic boom that really begins late when Kennedy is president, or very early when Johnson takes over, and it continues through basically the end of the decade. So the economic problems are not really an issue for him. I think that his, though, that what you end up with is an irony in the sense that he set out to do all these wonderful, good things for people. But anybody who remembers and has any sense of the state of the country in 1969, when he left office, knows it was in much worse shape than it was, say, in 1963, 1964. So you have this irony of all these great, wonderful intentions on the one hand, and then the results on the other hand. And that's one of the things that's difficult to reconcile. Now, some of it has to do with Vietnam, But that's not the only source of the problem. I think he would have been, even without Vietnam, he would have been in deep political trouble because of all the reaction domestically to what he had done.
Well, and here's the thing. I think we had a good thing going. I think that back in the 60s, when he proposed this war on poverty, obviously the war on poverty, I think we could all admit, was, from what he wanted, was a complete failure from what he envisioned. What he envisioned, like Reagan said earlier, was for the poor to have a fair chance to develop their own capacities. In other words, government would remove the obstacles holding them back through better schools, health, and training. That's the quote. Thus liberated, most poor people would become more productive, independent, and middle class. A phrase at the time was a hand up, not a handout. We're not seeing that at all. We're seeing a permanent underclass of people that are being paid so that they don't rise up and riot and demand change, because they're just kind of kept stable and happy to a certain degree, and in their comfort zone, while everything else happens on a higher level. We still have this multi-tiered society. We still have this stratified society. So it's really a complete failure, I would think.
Well, I think, there's some interesting historical aspects here, because for one thing, what you saw with Johnson's legislative program, he rushed it through. And I think at the time, even some of his friends said, you're moving too fast. These bills are not well written. They're not well designed. But Johnson was worried about getting things done, and then he thought you would work out the difficulties. And I think there's an interesting comparison there with health care today. I think it's pretty clear that they rushed the original health care bill through without worrying about all the problems, and now it's become apparent that this bill, the health care bill, I think is an utter disaster in most ways. So there's an interesting comparison there between then and now. And the other comparison I'd make is between LBJ and FDR, in the sense that I don't think the Great Society programs ever achieved the popularity and the support that the New Deal programs did. And I think one of the reasons was the New Deal program, Social Security being an excellent example, was one in which the government essentially gave people money. What you got with the Great Society was the idea you were going to give people services. And the government, in certain respects, is very good in handing out money to people, but not very good in getting people to do certain things and execute certain behaviors.
You mean like too much social engineering in it?
Yeah. And then the additional thing, I think, is that in the case of the Great Society, the real beneficiaries turned out to be the middlemen in this operation. The people who were providing the services. And so in certain ways, a lot of this money didn't go directly to the poor. It went to these intermediaries, and they were the ones who really did very well and very nicely. So
briefly, before we go, where do we go from here? Is this going to continue, or are we just going to see this thing grow and grow into a monstrosity, and then what happens there? Your prognostication based on history.
Well, I think I think there needs to be an effort to try and roll back the size of the government and the overreach of the government. But how it's going to happen is very difficult to understand, because, of course, what happens is all kinds of people have all kinds of vested interests in every government program. So getting them to give these things up is next to impossible.
Yeah. What the once you put it out there, it's very difficult to take it back, if not almost impossible. Yeah.
Even if you can prove that the program doesn't work.
Yeah. Oh, it's
because
amazing.
Even if it doesn't work, somebody's benefiting from it.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. Well, the clock runs all too fast when we get into these discussions, and again, I want to say thank you to Dr. Ed Kallina from the University of Central Florida History Department. Your observations are always greatly appreciated, and we hope that the folks along the network line take heed of what we're talking about, and at least give it some thought, folks. I mean, this is and take a look at your next paycheck and see how much of the taxes are gone, and what your net pay looks like, and think about some of the things we talked about in here today. So, anyways, this is the Florida Roundtable. I'm Reagan Smith.
And I'm Al Spry.
And we'll be back with a brief closing thought following these This is the Florida Roundtable. I'm Regan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
And again, our thanks to Dr. Ed Kallina from UCF for visiting with us today. And Al, you got one last headline to squeeze in here.
Yeah, Governor Rick Scott this past week tapped former legislator Carlos Lopez Cantera to be his running mate. Very smart move, appointing Carlos. I think, of course, the large Hispanic community in Florida.
Yeah, it absolutely is. The governor had been criticized for dragging his feet on naming a replacement for Jennifer Carroll. In the meantime, he saved us thousands and thousands of dollars. Hey, thank you for your time. I'm Regan Smith.
I'm Al Spry.
We'll see you next week.
You've been listening to Florida Roundtable, a weekly look at issues and problems of concern to Floridians from a state, national, and international perspective. Presented by the Florida News Network with your hosts, Regan Smith and Al Spry. The views and opinions expressed during the preceding program are solely those of the participants and not necessarily those of this station's ownership, management, or sponsors of FNN. Your views and opinions are welcome. Address your card or letter to Florida Roundtable in care of Regan Smith, 2500 Maitland Center Parkway, Suite 407, Maitland, Florida, 32751. Or you may email regansmith@fnnonline.com. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week for another edition of Florida Roundtable.